The final door stood open now by no human mechanism, and beyond it there was neither gold nor darkness, neither choir nor void, only depth vast enough that all images would have been lies.
There are places no map records because they do not belong to geography. They belong to sequence. A woman named Elise Martin came to one such place at the end of her life, though to call it the end is already to mislead. Ends imply direction, and direction was the first thing she began to lose.
She had died, as all human beings do, in a room made smaller by machines. There had been winter at the window, a nurse with tired eyes, a nephew holding her hand with the tender awkwardness of those who arrive late to love, but mean it sincerely. She had been 81, a retired teacher, widowed twice by different forms of time, and possessed in the final lucid months by one recurring fear, not death itself, but the possibility of meeting it unfinished. This fear had not come from crime. Elise was no murderer, no betrayer of nations, no architect of vast harm. Her sins were of the older and more common kind. She had withheld words that should have been given words that should have been withheld, chosen safety at certain crossroads and pride at others. She had lost a daughter in youth through estrangement more than fate, and spent decades telling herself that silence, once old enough, becomes dignity. It does not. It becomes architecture. When the last breath left her, she expected darkness, or light, or her mother's voice, or nothing at all. Human beings are imaginative about death, chiefly because so few survive disappointment there. Instead, she found herself standing in a corridor. It stretched in both directions without visible end, though stretching was not quite the right word. The corridor did not seem to occupy space so much as arrange possibility. Its walls were pale but not white. Its floor reflected no shadow. Along one side stood doors, many doors, each different in wood, shape, and age. Some were nursery doors with chipped paint. Some were black iron. Some resembled church panels, cellar hatches, schoolroom entries, hospital partitions. No handles were visible on any of them. At the farthest point she could perceive stood one final door, narrow and dark, lit around its edges by a radiance too soft to be called light and too exact to be mistaken for chance. Beside Elise stood a man. No, again, not quite. He wore the figure of a man because Elise still required persons for understanding. But what stood there carried the same relation to a man that a written note carries to a voice. It was an accommodation. He appeared middle-aged, grave, and dressed in a plain coat of uncertain time. His eyes held neither warmth nor judgment, only the terrible composure of something that had never once mistaken urgency for importance. He said her name, not aloud, yet she heard it more completely than she had ever heard anything. Elise asked whether she was dead. He answered that she had completed a life. That difference, slight as it sounded, unsettled her more than confirmation would have. She asked what the corridor was. He said it was the place through which a soul meets its own order. Then he asked her to begin. The first door opened before she touched it. Behind it lay her childhood kitchen in the spring of 1952. Her father was alive. Her mother was peeling apples. Rain moved over the small window above the sink. 8-year-old Elise stood by the table with a drawing in her hand, waiting to be praised. The scene seemed harmless enough until she understood she was not there to revisit its sweetness. She was there to notice what had once entered with it. Her father glanced at the drawing, smiled distractedly, and asked her to be useful by taking plates to the pantry. Nothing cruel, nothing loud. Yet in that small turning away, Elise felt again the first seed of a lifelong bargain. Love would be earned by not needing too much of it at once. The second door showed her at 19, standing outside a chapel in borrowed white, while the young man she nearly married begged her to say she was uncertain if she was uncertain. She had not loved him enough, but she had loved being chosen, and for one terrible minute, she had considered stepping into a life built entirely on gratitude and fear. She watched her younger self refuse him with the cold precision of someone relieved to be honest only after allowing another heart to approach the edge. The third door opened on a hospital room where her daughter Lisa sat at 17 with cheeks still wet from crying, and said she intended to leave home with a musician Elise considered beneath her. In life, Elise had remembered herself as stern but correct. Here she heard the actual words. Not worried, not protective, punitive. She had told Lisa that if she chose a foolish life, she need not return asking wiser people to rescue her from it. Lisa left. Years later, she died in another city after a brief illness. Elise was not summoned to witness. The corridor did not let Elise look away from that one quickly. Door after door, the pattern deepened. Not catastrophe, shape. Every life, she saw, arranges itself less around its dramatic moments than around the quiet principles accepted too early and defended too long. Her principle had been this: if one remained composed, one remained blameless. It had given her discipline, reputation, and a classroom full of students who remembered her as formidable. It had also cost her tenderness at every moment. Tenderness required a risk to dignity. At one door, she watched herself ignore a grieving neighbor because she feared tears would make her say something clumsy. At another, she saw the second husband she truly loved asking, very gently, why comfort always reached him from her in such perfect words and such untouched hands. At another, she stood in middle age before a telephone, hearing that Lisa might be willing to speak after all, and choosing not to call until the right time, as though reconciliation were a matter improved by better weather. She turned then to the figure in the coat and asked whether this was judgment. He answered that judgment, as the living imagine it, is too theatrical. This was proportion. She asked whether all souls were made to walk such a corridor. He said only those who had confused self-knowledge with self-excuse. She almost laughed at that, because had there ever lived a soul exempt from such confusion? But the laugh did not come. Too much of her had already begun to understand. As they moved farther down the passage, the doors changed. The earlier ones had opened onto memory. These opened onto absences. A room in which Lisa had once waited as a child for Elise to come sit at the bed after a nightmare. Elise had sent tea and a blanket instead. A summer path by the sea where her first husband had nearly confessed his fear of dying young, and, finding her briskness ready at hand, had chosen instead to speak of weather. A day of snowfall when she might have written the letter that would have reopened the world between herself and her daughter, and did not. At last, Elise understood the corridor's deepest cruelty. It was not showing what she had done. It was showing what she had prevented from existing. They came then to the final door, the narrow, dark one lit at the edges. She knew before asking that this was not another memory. The figure beside her said that all completed lives arrive here eventually. Some after long corridors, some after very short ones. Beyond this door lay no punishment in the dramatic sense, nor reward in the sentimental one. Beyond it, he said, a soul enters whatever truth it has become capable of enduring. Elise asked whether she would see her daughter. He replied that beyond the last door one sees nothing as possession, only as truth. She said that was not enough. For the first time, the figure's expression altered by the smallest degree, and she understood that what she had taken for severity was in fact mercy stripped of all the decorations human beings require in order not to be terrified by it. He told her that enough is a word for the living. She stood before the door a long while. In life, she had imagined death, when she imagined it at all, as revelation granted from without, a kingdom, a verdict, a reunion perhaps, arranged like a drawing room for the morally tired. But this place had taught her something harder and finer. Eternity, if such a thing existed, would not begin by flattering the soul. It would begin by removing every excuse under which the soul had hidden from its own shape. At last she asked whether there was still time, if time could be spoken of there, for regret. The figure answered that regret is merely pain until it consents to become understanding. Then he asked whether she wished to carry hers unopened through the last threshold, or whether she would name it first. Elise, who had spent a lifetime polishing silence into virtue, began at last to speak. She spoke Lisa's name. She said she had loved badly where she might have loved plainly. She said fear had worn too many borrowed dignities in her life. She said she had often chosen not to wound her pride and called the result wisdom. She wept then, not theatrically, not in the performative way the living weep when they half expect to be consoled, but with the raw astonishment of a soul discovering how light truth becomes once it is finally heavier than defense. When she finished, the corridor had changed. Not disappeared, not softened, but the doors behind her no longer seemed accusatory. They seemed complete. Even the absences had become not pardonable, but visible enough to stop governing her in secret. The final door stood open now by no human mechanism, and beyond it there was neither gold nor darkness, neither choir nor void, only depth vast enough that all images would have been lies. Elise took one step toward it, then another, and just before crossing she felt, not saw, not heard, but felt the presence of every love she had failed to answer properly and every love that had somehow survived her failures long enough to remain true without her management. It did not absolve her. It did something harder. It received her honestly. For the last mystery awaiting mankind was never whether there would be something after death, but whether the soul, arriving there stripped of time, pride, and all its carefully cultivated disguises, could endure the full shape of its own life without turning away. And if there is mercy beyond the final threshold, perhaps it begins not in forgetfulness, nor in reward, but in that terrible and beautiful instant when what we have been is at last made proportionate to what we might still become. These are the doors of the unconscious mind, and they all, one way or the other, lead to the light beyond shadow.